Are you confused about microbes in your soil? Should you be adding more to increase that number? Should you be doing things differently in the garden so you don't harm them? And should you care about microbes anyways? What's the big deal with them? Now, if you're confused, I'm not surprised. The internet is full of garbage about microbes. You're bombarded with all kinds of incorrect information, both on blogs and YouTube channels. There's dozens and dozens of videos that show you how to make microbe soups and how to spread them around the garden. And they tell you how wonderful these things are. And manufacturers are pushing their products. Well, in this program, we're going to have a look at the truth of all this. We're going to understand why microbes are important in the soil and why you should care. We're going to look at what you can do to take care of your microbes and increase the number. And we're going to have a look at a lot of these solutions that are promoted on the internet. And finally, I'm going to introduce you to a secret that I haven't seen promoted anywhere, and is probably the easiest and best way to grow microbes in soil. Let's have a quick look at why microbes in soil are important. Microbes decompose organic matter, and as they do that, they release nutrients, and your plants need those nutrients. So it's really the microbes in soil that are feeding your plants. More microbes, better growing plants. It's a simple equation. Now let's be clear here. I'm talking about growing in the soil, outside, using real soil. I'm not going to discuss potted plants in this program. That's a whole different story, and their microbes are not that important. But outside, they are. The second important thing that microbes do is they actually improve your soil. That nice, black, fluffy, crumbly soil that you'd like to have in your garden, that's made by microbes. And by paying attention to the microbe population in your garden, you will get better soil. Another simple equation. In fact, when you think about gardening, it's more about growing microbes than growing plants. I know you focus on the rows, but the real solution is to take care of the microbes in the soil beneath that rows, and the rows grows all on its own. Take care of your microbes and you can grow anything you want in the soil, provided you have the right climate and soil conditions. Before I discuss ways of increasing the microbes in your soil, we should look at the ones you already have. How many microbes are in your soil? I mean, I see lots of comments online saying, oh, I have really poor soil and my microbe level is really low. How do I increase this? The reality is that no matter how crappy your soil is, you have a huge amount of microbes. This is what we find in a typical soil sample. Bacteria are there in numbers like 100 million to a billion. And this is in 1 gram of soil. A gram of soil is equivalent to the weight of a small paperclip. Or as I like to tell gardeners, it's about the amount of soil under your fingernails after an hour of good gardening. It's a tiny, tiny amount of soil, and yet you can have 100 million bacteria. And that's in soil that's not great. How about fungi? Well, fungi are larger, so there's less of them, but still, they range in the number of 100,000 to a million. Algae and cyanobacteria are smaller organisms, and you get 1,000 to a million of those. Protozoa are larger, and you have 1,000 to 100,000. Nematodes, up to 5,000 nematodes in that 1 gram of soil. What that means is that even if you have crappy soil, you've got billions and billions and billions of microbes throughout the soil layer. You have lots. Now, if you want a better garden, you want even more. But don't let people tell you you don't have enough. I hear this all the time about compost piles too. We put all our organic matter in that compost pile, and then we have to add an activator. An activator is microbes. You don't need an activator. Every piece of material is covered with billions of bacteria and fungi. They're ready to decompose that. If you want to learn more about composting, have a look at my book, Compost Science for Gardeners. All right, so microbes are important. Gardeners want more of them. How do we get more? Well, before we look at adding microbes to the soil, let's look at what they really need. Microbes are like you and I. They need 3 basic things: air, water, and food. As a gardener, it's your job to give them those 3 things. So let's look at air first. What surprises a lot of people is that 25% of soil is actually air. That's a large amount. And because microbes breathe air just like us, they need oxygen and they breathe out CO2, they need lots of air. They need that air to be exchanged and refreshed. If they're living in a place that doesn't get enough oxygen, many of the microbes die off. How do we give them more air? There's not much a gardener can do here. But one thing you can do is stop compacting your soil. Anything that compacts soil, squeezes the soil particles together, squeezes out the air, you end up with less air, which results in fewer microbes. Every time you step on the soil, you compact that soil. That's why it's a good idea to have permanent pathways. We compact the soil there, but where the plants are growing, we leave that alone. Try not to step in your garden bed. The other thing that compacts soil is rain droplets. Believe it or not, rain droplets are strong enough to come down and pound that soil. That's why you get a crust forming on the soil. It's pounded soil. The structure's gone and it's compacted. And that's not good for microbes. How do we stop that from happening? It's simple. Mulch. When you put mulch over the soil, the mulch takes the impact of the raindrop and your soil is preserved. Now, a lot of you think tilling reduces compaction, and it does for a short period of time. But in fact, below the line in which you loosen the soil, you actually compact it, and you destroy soil structure, which is also important for getting air in. So don't till. All right, what about water? Why is water important? Well, we talk about microbes living in soil, but the reality is that most microbes don't live in soil. They live in water. Every soil particle has a little bit of water around it, and they live in that layer of water. Most microbes need to be in water. So when soil gets too dry, what happens? Well, they either die off, or many of them will go into a state of hibernation. They'll go dormant. They just sit there and do nothing until water returns. So it's important to keep your soil watered. Now, you don't want to flood the soil because remember, they also need air. But we don't want really dry soil. Again, mulch is great because it keeps moisture in the ground, keeps microbes happy. And that's one reason I'm such a big believer in mulch. The third thing that microbes need is food. Well, what do microbes eat? Well, they eat anything that's organic. And when I say organic, I'm using the term in the chemical sense, not in the certified organic sense. That's really not important to microbes. So they eat leaves, they eat juices from plants, they eat other microbes, they eat dead microbes. One of the best foods for microbes is compost or manure or partially composted material. Anything that was living and is on its way to decomposing. And in fact, that decomposition process, that thing that happens in your compost pile, it's done entirely by microbes. They're slowly eating and digesting all that organic material, and that's their favorite food source. When we increase the amount of organic material in soil, we provide them with more food, which results in more microbes. It's really that simple. Let me give you a little example here. Let's say you just moved into a new subdivision and the builders have come along and they've taken all the topsoil off. That's where all the microbes and the organic matter live. When they take that away, then they build the house and then they bring a small amount of that good soil back. Now people say, well, the garden's not very good. The soil isn't very good in these new homes. And you're right, because the good stuff was taken away and now you're left with subsoil. It doesn't have much organic matter. It has fewer microbes. So what's the solution there? It's not to add more microbes. The solution is to increase the level of organic matter. And when you do that, the microbes grow. So to increase the microbes in your soil, you do three things. Reduce compaction, keep the soil moist, and add organic matter. Really that simple. So now you know how to take care of the microbes you have, and you even know how to increase the number. Add organic matter. Now, I've mentioned compost and manure as being good options. Some people online promote other things like molasses and milk. But when we add these things, we do see a spike in microbes because both of those contain carbon. And milk also has some nitrogen in it, and that is microbe food. So we apply that to the soil, and what we see is a sudden increase in microbes. Many of these microbes grow very quickly. Bacteria in ideal conditions can divide and double in number every 20 minutes. So they grow very rapidly. and you've just added some molasses, and that's great food. It's mostly sugar, and that's like candy to bacteria. They gobble it up, they grow, they multiply. You get this big spike in number, and then the food runs out. Now, initially, that's not a problem because some of these bacteria are dying off and others eat them, so there's still food available. But eventually, all that food runs out, the population crashes, and you're back to where you were before. Molasses and milk and other products like that are not good for feeding microbes. Compost, on the other hand, is great because it takes them a long time to decompose that. That takes up to 5 years to decompose in soil, and that's continually feeding the microbes during that whole period of time. Various garden teas are also highly promoted online. Things like compost tea, manure tea, and weed tea. You basically take these materials, put it in a bucket, add some water, stir it around, let it sit for a few days. Sometimes you add air to speed up that process. And what you end up with is this liquid that is just full of nutrients. So you apply that to your garden. Now that sounds like a great thing to do. The problem is the amount of nutrients in the water is still very small. In fact, most of the nutrients are in the sludge in the bottom of the pail. The sludge is more valuable to the microbes than the water is because most of that organic matter hasn't decomposed yet. Now, there's lots of studies looking at this, and they do show improved plant growth. The problem with these studies is they compared teas to water, and we know that these teas contain nutrients. We also know that when we add nutrients to soil, plants grow better. There's no magic here. You can't compare compost tea to water. You have to compare compost tea to compost. There are very few studies that have looked at that, but the ones that have found the tea makes no difference. There is no value in making these various tea concoctions. As far as adding nutrients to the soil, as far as feeding these microbes, there's no point in making these teas. Another approach to increasing microbes in your soil is to add them. And that seems to make so much sense, right? We have 1 billion microbes in a gram of soil. Why don't we add some to that and we'll have 2 billion? There are some basic flaws in this process. The first one is that soil has a maximum capacity for microbes. There's only room for so many. Now, if you have crappy soil, there isn't room for very many. I mean, we're still talking billions and billions in a garden, but that's a small number compared to good soil. Good soil has a higher capacity. It can hold 10 times as many microbes. Each type of soil has a capacity, and that capacity is pretty much controlled by the amount of food that's available. Microbes are always at full capacity. They multiply so quickly that no matter where they are, they multiply to fill the available space and availability of food. When we add more microbes into that situation, you don't actually get an increase in number. Almost all the ones you add die off because there's no room for them. I liken this to a football stadium. The big game is on, the seats are full with fans, and another 1,000 fans show up and want to get in. They can't buy tickets because there's no seats available. The stadium is at capacity, and having more people arrive does not add more people to the stadium. Your soil is exactly the same. It's always at capacity. There's no room for more microbes. So adding microbes does not really work. You're probably sitting there wondering, well, just a minute, there's all kinds of ways to add these microbes. There's all kinds of online information. Well, let's have a close look at some of these ways of adding microbes. One of the most common is compost tea. So you have some people who think that compost tea is there to provide nutrients for microbes. That's microbe food. But then you have another group of people who are brewing the tea to grow microbes. They don't care about the nutrients. In fact, they freely admit the nutrients don't add much value. It's the microbes you want. So they're brewing this pail of microbes, and then they're spreading the microbes around to increase the number of microbes in soil. Well, there have been many studies on this, and the reality is that it doesn't increase the number in soil. And the reason is that soil is already at capacity. Now, there have been a few recent studies that have shown that the actual population changes a bit. Maybe 1% of the population changes, but we don't know what effect that has on the soil. It may not have any effect at all. How many different types of microbes are there in soil? Well, we really don't know the answer to that. We think that we've identified about 20% of the microbes that are in soil. That means 80% we know nothing about. We do know that there's thousands and thousands of different species in every soil sample. Some estimates say there might be as many as 100,000 different species, and we don't know anything about most of them. And even the 20% that we know something about, we actually know almost nothing about how these populations interact in soil. The latest hot button I see is photosynthetic bacteria. These are bacteria that can actually photosynthesize. They use the light and produce organic compounds. Now, there are some studies that show that adding these to soil can be effective. The problem is that these studies use a specific organism. They brew it up knowing how to brew that organism. They measure how much they have, and then they apply it to the soil and say, we've seen a change. Compare that to a gardener. A gardener takes a pail of water, throws in some kind of compost, organic matter, there's some soil samples, wherever they want. They brew it up, they get some brown stuff, they think they have photosynthetic bacteria, and then they spread it around saying, hey, this stuff really works. Well, they don't know what they're doing. They could be creating pathogens and spreading those around. When you're brewing things like compost tea, you have no idea what you're brewing. The other option you have is you can go to the store and you can buy microbes for your soil. And they're sold under a number of different names. Soil probiotics, mycorrhizal fungi, beneficial bacteria, EM. That stands for effective microbes. These are all products that you can buy, and they all claim the same thing. By adding them to your soil, you will increase the number of microbes, and you'll end up with better soil. Well, what does the science say about all these products? Well, let's get back to the number of microbes in soil. We're talking thousands, tens of thousands of different species. And these products usually contain 3, 6, maybe a dozen different species. And those species have been selected because they're the ones that are easy to grow in a factory. They weren't selected because they're the ones that your soil is missing. Now we take that small number of species, we add it to soil that's at capacity, and what happens? Not very much. In fact, I recently contacted 5 manufacturers of these products and asked each one of them to show me the scientific evidence that they have that confirms their product works. Out of 5 products, not one of them had such a scientific study. And since then, a 6th one has contacted me bragging about their product, and they wanted me to test it. So I asked them for a study too. They didn't have one either. If you look at the marketing material, it says microbes in nature work. They're important, which is true. And we have a bottle of microbes, so it also works. But that doesn't mean that second statement is true. Now, there is some evidence for very specific microbes. They can fight very specific diseases in agricultural situations. And there is some scientific evidence that in drought conditions, these mycorrhizal fungi can help out plants. So in very stressed conditions, they may actually work. I haven't found any scientific evidence that they work in your garden. And I've talked to 4 different scientists who actually study mycorrhizal fungi. And I asked them, should we be adding this to the garden? And they said, no, it probably won't do any good. I also asked them if we should add it to potted plants. And they said, no, it doesn't work there either. The bottom line is commercial products will not increase the microbes in your garden. So how do you increase those microbes? Well, it's really quite simple. You add organic matter, you feed them. And the best things you can use there are compost, organic matter, and all the vegetation that comes from your garden, you leave it in the garden. Falling leaves, dead flowers, whatever it is, put it in your garden. That's organic matter that feeds microbes. The second most important thing you can do is to plant things. Now you're probably thinking, well, how does that work? I mean, plants take nutrients out of soil. They're actually competing with microbes for the food. And that is true partially. But we've learned a lot about plants, and they form associations with microbes. So what happens around the roots is that plants actually feed the microbes. 20 to 40% of the photosynthase, those are the chemicals that come out of the plant because of photosynthesis, are sent down to the roots. They're squeezed out of the roots to feed the microbes. So around the roots, we have this huge number of microbes. And the plant does that for a lot of good reasons. Those microbes are eating each other and they're releasing nitrogen, and that feeds the plant. They're also digesting soil particles, and that feeds the plant. And those microbes protect the plant from pathogens. So the plant is growing microbes around its roots. So one of the best things you can do to improve soil is grow plants. Those plants feed the microbes, they increase the number of microbes in soil, and your soil gets better. As plant roots die off, that's organic matter. So plants are basically creating a compost pile around their roots, which increases the number of microbes. So the two things you should do in your garden: plant things, keep the soil covered at all times, and add extra organic matter when possible. Forget about all the other nonsense on the internet. Don't brew teas, don't buy concoctions. They don't work. Gardening can be so simple if we just ignore a lot of the garbage that's. If you'd like to learn more about microbes, have a look at my book, Microbe Science for Gardeners. A lot of the information I presented in this program is expanded in that book. And there's whole chapters about these different kinds of microbes and the interaction between microbes and plants. Microbes really are the key to good gardening. Now, if you'd like to learn more about microbes, you can also watch this video here. And I have a whole series of videos on soil, and that's right here. Take care of your microbes, and happy gardening.